Hello, everyone, and welcome to this podcast introduction to this week's Listening to America. I'm Clay Jenkinson. I'm actually in my living room. Let me describe it for you. I'm not in my studio today for some reason. There is a gas fireplace. On top of it, there are two vases with shocks of wheat, which is what North Dakota does in this world. There is a beautiful little statuette of the Eiffel Tower. There are some building blocks I made for my daughter when she was born with the Greek alphabet. You have no idea how much trouble that was. But she did eventually go on to study classical Greek at Columbia University, and she was my co-host just a couple of days ago for 10 days in Greece, and was marvelous. We had such a great time. There's a skull, I'm sorry to say. Every Renaissance humanist has a skull on his mantelpiece. And the Horse of Selene from the Parthenon marbles, purchased at the British Museum. And we were just at the Parthenon. And my daughter went back. This is so interesting. We were at the Parthenon, and we had a long debate about whether the marbles should be returned from England. Lord Elgin looted them, I think it's only fair to say, in 1807. Wound up selling them to the British Museum. They've been there ever since. Greece wants them back, of course. They should go back. Greece has a spectacular museum waiting for them. There's no argument that England can any longer use to keep them, but of course they do so far. And so we were there. We had this debate. We went to both the Acropolis and then down to the Acropolis Museum, which is world class. And then my daughter went back to Britain, arrived at like 4 a.m, and the next day she had to get up and take a train to London because an old friend from Kansas was there and wanted to go to high tea at one of the fancy places in London. But she took them to the British Museum, and they went to the Elgin Marbles room. And so in one 10-day period, she got to see the marbles that were looted, the building from which they were pried off and sometimes broken, and the museum in Athens, which makes the case for their return. So she got a fuller cultural tour than any of the rest of us did, including myself. I so envied her. I would have loved to have flown back to London with her and gone to the British Museum. I've been there probably 25 times. And it is truly one of the great museums, and the Parthenon marbles are in an absolutely spectacular room in the museum. So all of that is just to acquaint you with my little world. I so appreciate you. I asked some people on the Greek trip if they like the podcast introduction, and everyone said yes, but several said, yeah, but you need a second voice. And we are looking for a second voice. We need a new host. David Swenson has retired, alas. I love him and was very sorry to see him go, but he has reached his 70th birthday, and he was on to a Candide-like retirement with his garden across town here in Bismarck. Lindsay Chervinsky and I just had a conversation. I'll tell you about it in a minute. She's here to stay. Nicandria, of course. Joe Ellis is ready to come back for more conversations. A temporary host is my friend David Horton of Radford College in Virginia. He's excellent. We'll be doing more with him. But I'm looking for a semi-permanent guest host of the Thomas Jefferson Hour, preferably female. It can't be Lindsay because she's a star, not an interlocutor. And I ask you this, people on the trip said they want more of me, less of me interviewing people, but more of me commenting on the world to the best of my lights, and maybe some Jefferson Watch essays again. So you let me know what you like and dislike and what you want done. We've had a transition from the Swenson era to the post-Swenson era, and it's been hard because he was such a central figure in the Jefferson Hour and in my life, but we're doing it, and I think we're doing good things, and we're going to do great things. So stay with us. This program was something I cooked up the other night in my sleep. I woke up, I was jet-lagged after coming home from Greece, and I woke up thinking, I want to create 10 propositions about Thomas Jefferson, about whom I've spent my life thinking now, and I want to put them to Lindsay and see what she says. And so they were really interesting theses, so Luther had his 95 theses, so I have my 10 on Jefferson. Here they are. Number 1, Jefferson can be considered the most indispensable of the founders because he articulated the idea, capital I, of America. Jefferson's seeming duplicity at times is really more something that you would expect in a Jane Austen novel, where he's hesitant to be candid because he loves harmony and he's so highly mannered. Lindsay disagreed with that. 3, Jefferson was the right person to write the Declaration of Independence because he turned it into an immortal document when it would have been just a state paper and not particularly famous had somebody else written it. She agreed mostly with that. Jefferson must be seen, number 4, as a Renaissance man, as a great man of extraordinary accomplishment in so many different areas, and also the President of the United States. Whereas we think of others as the President of the United States, and we assess them on that scale. But Jefferson must be assessed for the brilliance, for his Da Vinci-like capacity, his enormous curiosity, his ability to know a great deal about a great number of subjects and to keep them gracefully in his lucid correspondence. And so the presidency, in some sense, is the least important part of assessing Thomas Jefferson. She mostly agreed with that. Number 5, Jefferson's love affair with rebellion. I like a little rebellion now and then, and the tree of liberty must be refreshed with the blood of patriots and tyrants. That's actually really irresponsible, and it's turned out to be very dangerous, as we saw on January 6th, that streak of bloodthirstiness in Jefferson, which caused Connor Cruz O'Brien to say that he was, the analogy in our time would be Pol Pot of Cambodia. A little extreme there, Connor Cruz. But that streak in Jefferson, I think, has shown how dangerous it can be in recent years, and that danger is not over yet. Number 6, Jefferson on race is more complicated than we like to think, and we should be very, very, very careful not to oversimplify this, including, of course, the question of Sally Hemings, but that he was a racist, he was an apartheidist, he was a slaveholder, he perpetuated slavery, wrung his hands in a good way, but he didn't do much. And yet it's not quite as simple as the righteous want to put it. No one can defend Jefferson on slavery, and I don't mean to, ever. But it is a complex situation, and we should look on it in its complexity, including the Sally Hemings story. Number 7, Adams got the better of Jefferson in their late 1812 to 1826 correspondence. We agreed heartily on that. Number 8, Jefferson's lifelong fascination with the American West was the making of the continent. Lindsay did disagree with that. She thought that everyone wanted to expand into the West, and George Washington certainly has to be put into that equation. Washington, who was one of the sponsors of the Potomac Canal and the opening up of the interior. Of course, Washington went into the Ohio country. Jefferson never left the eastern seaboard. So we disagreed about that one. Number 9, Jefferson's optimism makes no sense. His belief that humans are inherently good makes no sense. It's hard to understand how Thomas Jefferson, with all of his brilliance and his deep reading of human history, could have believed that humans are basically good. If that's so, boy, we have failed in education because, we live on the other side of Pol Pot in Cambodia. We live on the other side of the Holocaust. We live on the other side of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. We live on the other side of the brutalities of World War I and the Civil War. It's hard to look at our history, even the history of the United States internally, and not to come somewhere around the Augustinian view that humans have a fallenness. There's a kink. There's a kink in our system. And then number 10, Jefferson was the most radical as well as the most democratic of the founders. We agreed upon that. So just to review, indispensable, she didn't agree that Jefferson is the most indispensable of the founding fathers. Duplicity, she didn't really agree. She thinks Jefferson's just a liar at times, and I have to say I do too. We agreed on the importance of Jefferson writing the Declaration of Independence. We mostly agreed that Jefferson must be judged by the whole man and not merely by his presidency. We agreed that his love affair with violence and the tree of liberty being refreshed with blood and so on has become a dangerous proposition and never really made sense anyway. We agreed that Jefferson doesn't have a leg to stand on with respect to race and slavery, but that it's important to see this as a complex phenomenon and dynamism. We agreed that Adams got the better of Jefferson in the late correspondence. we agreed, no, we didn't agree that the West was Jefferson's gift to America. Lindsay believes that Jefferson played an important role, but by no means the central role in all of that. We agreed wholeheartedly that Jefferson's optimism doesn't really square with any realistic observation of the nature of humanity, and we agreed that Jefferson was the most radical, major figure at least, among the Founding Fathers, with maybe an asterisk for Thomas Paine, who wasn't really one of us in some sense, and also Patrick Henry at times. So those are my propositions. I suppose that you would say that I'm a little disillusioned about Jefferson at this point in my life. I still love him. I love Thomas Jefferson. I can't imagine my life without Thomas Jefferson in it. I want to live in Thomas Jefferson's America, except for the race question and gender. I believe we would be a better people if we were more Jeffersonian in all those other respects. I don't discount Jefferson. I don't despise Jefferson. I find him perplexing at times, but I am not a critic of Thomas Jefferson. But I am not naive, if I ever was, about Jefferson's greatness. I think it has to be contextualized in a very large number of ambiguities and ambivalences. That's today's edition of Listening to America. We need your help. Sign up for my next online course, which is about Books of the Road, Kerouac's On the Road, and Steinbeck's Travels with Charlie. Go to the website, ltamerica.org, sign up for our newsletter, contribute to the program if you can. I'm going on the road next year, Travels with Charlie, all the way around from Long Island to Long Island by way of the Great Lakes, Seattle, Monterey, San Diego, Amarillo, New Orleans, and so on. This is a very, very exciting time in my life and career, and I'm so glad you're along for the ride, and I hope you keep listening and tell everyone you know and help me to achieve these goals, and particularly your suggestions and criticisms. I'm getting a lot of mail now from people who say, you know, if you're going to go to Alabama, you need to do X, and if you're going to go to Massachusetts, you need to do Y, and here's someone you should interview, and here's some things you should go see. I want you to be part of this road gig. I'll be alone in the Airstream, but you'll be with me in all sorts of virtual ways, and I need and want your help. Bless you, everybody, and I will see you next week for another issue of Listening to America. Thanks very much. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this special edition of Listening to America with Clay Jenkinson. I have the great pleasure today of sitting across from Lindsay Chervinsky, who has finished her second book, this one on John Adams. And today we're talking about 10 propositions about Thomas Jefferson. I've laid out 10 theses about my man, Mr. Jefferson, and I'm very eager to have Lindsay's reaction. Welcome, my friend.
Thank you. I am very much looking forward to this conversation.
Are you rested now after your ordeal?
I am, although, I don't know about you, but I don't do well with not doing much for long, so I do find an awful lot of ways to fill the time. And so September was quite busy because that's Constitution Day, of course, so lots of speaking and traveling and all wonderful opportunities and good things, but I wouldn't necessarily say a down month.
So, to turn to the third president of the United States. Here are the 10 propositions. I hope we can get to all of them. Number 1, Jefferson can be considered the most indispensable of the founders because he articulated the idea of America for his entire generation and beyond. He is our national visionary. Number 2, Jefferson's seeming duplicity at times may be understood as a kind of Jane Austen character gentlemanliness in which he disliked confronting or disagreeing with those with whom he had intercourse. Number 3, nobody else could have written the Declaration of Independence into immortal fame. Others could have written it, but none the way Jefferson did. Number 4, Jefferson must be seen as a Renaissance man who just happened also to be the President of the United States. That is, his greatness cannot be measured by his political career. Number 5, Jefferson's love affair with revolution and what he called a little rebellion now and then has had a deeply negative influence on American history, never so much as now. Number 6, Jefferson has had much to answer for on race and slavery, but it is not unfailingly a bad record. It is important to be attentive to ambivalence and nuance on this most volatile of questions. Number 7, John Adams got the better of Jefferson in the late correspondence between 1812 and 1826, and in some respects Adams was, quote, the bigger man. Number 8, Jefferson's lifelong fascination with the American West was the making of our continental America. Of his near contemporaries, not even George Washington had such a continental vision. I think only Jefferson was capable of the Louisiana Purchase. Number 9, many of Jefferson's optimisms were based on an erroneous reading of human nature. And number 10, Jefferson was the most radical as well as the most democratic of the founders. My dear friend Lindsay, I'm guessing you don't agree with all of that. Let's start with the first one. Jefferson can be considered the most indispensable of the founders. Now, I know that a famous multi-volume biography of Washington called him the indispensable man. I'm guessing you agree with that.
I do. I should start by saying that you did acknowledge prior to us pressing record that the particular phrasing of some of these was designed to entice a colorful conversation. So I applaud you for that because you will be, I think, successful. And interestingly, as I was going through, I was sort of counting the ones that I instinctually agreed with and some of the ones that I didn't. And I think you'll be surprised that it's not quite 50-50, but close. This is one that I disagree with, and here's why. If you had said that Thomas Jefferson was the indispensable man for maybe the age of revolutions, I think that is an argument that I could at least understand or at least get behind partially. But for the American Revolution and for our nation, the problem with that argument is that by the time Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence, the war had been going for over a year. Second, there had been, as the great Pauline Maier wrote in a book called American Scripture, there were hundreds of declarations. So the concept of a Declaration of Independence was not particularly revolutionary. 3, by the time Jefferson wrote it, the reason he was given permission to write it is because people were already supporting this concept. So while the phrasing is brilliant and I think went on to inspire other revolutions, hence my argument about the age of revolutions, for the American version, I don't actually think it was all that important in terms of sparking the flame of things. And then when we think about what comes after declaring independence, which I believe was much more of a foreign policy statement than a domestic statement, Jefferson played relatively little role during the Revolution, and he played relatively little role in the constitutional era. And while I think he was a good and important Secretary of State, he wasn't indispensable in that sort of early foundational period. You know who I think is indispensable, and that is Washington. But I think I've made that argument for our listeners before.
So you're, in a certain sense, conflating numbers 1 and 3. One is that he was the most indispensable of the founders because he articulated the idea of America. And I don't just mean in the Declaration of Independence there, but in his letters, in his inaugural addresses, in his state papers, in notes on Virginia, and so on. But number 3, and we'll just skip to it, is nobody else could have written the Declaration of Independence as an immortal document. And I think you rightly said its magnificence comes later, how deeply inspiring it is and has been. At the time, it was a sort of news release announcing the birth of Americans seeking foreign aid.
Yes, and I think we could actually be even more specific, which is that the list of grievances are not necessarily even the part that makes it a timeless document. It's really the lengthy preamble. What is that is, so inspiring and continues to inspire people to this day. And I think continued to articulate a set of principles that the nation has yet to live up to. And so that is, I think, the immortal document. And that was one of the ones that I agreed with you about because Jefferson did have extraordinary ability to craft a phrase. And his extraordinary ability did make it timeless, but I think it is later. And, I think if we're thinking about documents that actually articulate the nation, there are a lot of them. I think the Constitution and the preamble to the Constitution is one of the best. So I think that, he is indispensable for international thought. I'm not sure he's indispensable for crafting the idea of the American nation.
But assuming that he had not turned up and it was a near miss, he would have preferred to stay at Monticello. He thought the action was really in Virginia, not in Philadelphia. His mother had just died. He had a fragile spouse who was ill, and he spent a lot of time fretting about that in Philadelphia. Had he not been there, somebody else would have gotten this assignment, surely, and that person would have written an extraordinary state paper, I believe. But it could never, in my view, have been this sort of lyrical, magnificent, evocative Enlightenment document that Jefferson wrote. He had a unique capacity for that sort of thing.
No, yeah, I don't disagree with that. I think that the impact of that would have been felt probably more starting in the 1790s when the Haitian Revolution starts to pick up this rhetoric, and then in the early 1800s when Latin American nations pick up this rhetoric and things of that nature. So I think the impact, if someone else had crafted it, would have been felt later.
It would have been a more limited document. I think it would have stayed closer to the purpose of just saying, we have a right to revolution, we're invoking that right, here's our list of grievances, here we go. And I think Jefferson had the capacity always to sort of see through the moment and to try to say the most lofty and enlightened possible thing about the subject. Of course, he didn't always live up himself to those ideals, but I think that's a unique power that he had. So, all right, we've done 2 here. I hope we will be able to get to all of them, my friend. The second one, and this is, of course, a huge problem in Jefferson studies, his duplicity, that almost everyone who knew him, and including people who respected him, said there's a difference between the Jefferson you meet on the street or in a salon somewhere with his exquisite manners and politeness, his love of harmony, and then there's Jefferson when he's not in your zip code, and they're frequently quite different Jeffersons, and that he's capable of not just duplicity, but outright lying. And I think we could establish that Jefferson told important lies on a number of occasions, including to George Washington. So my point is that one way of looking at this, Lindsay, is that he had these exquisite manners, and he hated conflict of all sorts, and so he was more likely to express conciliatory things in the presence of others and be a little more tough and critical in the privacy of his room with pen and paper. Do you think that in any way defends him against this charge?
I think it maybe defends against some charges. I think it certainly defends against the dislike of political rancor, the dislike of maybe the contentious political battles in the cabinet or the ones that Hamilton embraced. When we think of sort of the Jane Austen manners, they talked about having like an easy disposition or a friendly face or being pleasant to be around. And those were all things that I think he held in high esteem. There were moments, though, when he, as you pointed out, outright lied. And I don't think that fits, because the sort of honor system and the morality code established in that period did value honesty and in sort of standing up for one's principles and taking responsibility for one's actions. It's a major theme throughout the Austen novels is, if you are a man of honor, you have to take responsibility for the poor decisions that you have made, and even if that is uncomfortable. The last piece, and I think this duplicity thing is, it's complicated because it's outward duplicity, but then I think what a lot of people bump up against is the inward duplicity, in that Jefferson articulates a series of principles and then often fails to live up to them internally. And as we've discussed before, that is in some ways a human condition. We all fail to live up to our principles from time to time. I always like to point to, I'm very concerned about climate change, and yet I'm on a plane an awful lot, and those are not necessarily consistent actions. And so he can certainly be forgiven for some of the more day-to-day transgressions against his set of values. But things like, one of the funnier ones is he believed it was really important to, not be overly spendy, to not be flagrant in your expenses, and yet could not help but constantly buy more books and buy tons of French wine. And while his debt when he died was not entirely his fault, it was certainly in large part his fault. And that is, I think, an inconsistency in principles that Jane Austen would have had an awful lot to say about.
I agree with that. We need to take a short break. We're talking about 10 propositions, my propositions about Thomas Jefferson. We've been over 3, but I want to come back a little bit to duplicity when we return. This is a special edition of Listening to America. We'll be back in just a moment. Welcome back to this special edition of Listening to America. My dear friend Lindsay Chervinsky is virtually across from me, across the country. So, Lindsay, we were talking about Jefferson's duplicity. Nobody can really doubt that. I mean, someone like Dumas Malone attempted to make the best of it. Occasionally, even he had to say this doesn't put Jefferson in necessarily the best light. Jefferson lied to Washington on a couple of occasions, including a very important one. He lied to John Adams on a couple of occasions. He lied to Abigail Adams on a couple of occasions. It's hard for me to square that with what I know about Jefferson, but it does seem to be indisputable. So, one of the cliches we have about these things is that people lie so often to each other that they wind up believing in their own lies. I feel certain that Jefferson, on the whole, thought he was a man of great candor.
That's I think you're right, that we have a dialogue about ourselves. We have a narrative about ourselves that we would really like to be true. And maybe it needs to be true in order for us to sort of continue in the human existence. And that's part of evolution, that we just are really quite capable of convincing ourselves of these things. I don't find him a particularly honest man. And I'm not sure that he was always I think he perhaps was least honest about himself sometimes, which is interesting given how insightful he could be about so many other things.
He wanted to be a certain type of human being, above the fray, dispassionate, humble, conciliatory, deeply civil, and he created that persona. And it is a beautiful persona, and in large part, we believe in that persona with Jefferson. But behind that, I'm going to call it a mask, that's maybe too severe a term, but behind that mask there was a kind of a routine politician, too, who could give as well as he took, and who could be vicious and could go after his enemies and could mischaracterize other people's statements and writings, and who had a certain lust for victory, especially where he considered it to be central to the future of human liberty, which is sort of the way he liked to talk anyway, isn't it? I think that it's hard when you first realize that Jefferson was capable of just being a kind of routine politician. It's really hard to square that with this kind of lovely, high-minded persona that he created. And I think people have puzzled over that since the beginning. I think people of his own time puzzled over it. In other words, they didn't just say, oh, what a hypocrite. They just couldn't quite figure out what that signified.
Well, I think maybe one of the reasons that people then and now have struggled so much with it was because he was so good, I think, at convincing himself that the mask was the real him. Here's why I say that. It's not unusual for public figures to have a public self and a private self. It's, I was just doing some reading about Eisenhower, and publicly he was very genial, he was affable, he was sort of always in a good mood, but in private he could have a real temper, which actually reminded me a lot of Washington. And we've talked before about how Washington put up sort of his own marble facade of what he wanted to be seen as. And so I don't necessarily hold that part against him, because if someone lives a public life, they're going to keep a part of themselves private. And I don't think that that's wrong per se. I do think that's what makes truly authentic people so unusual, that what you see is what you get regardless of where you are. And I think with Jefferson, the problem is that most politicians would acknowledge that discrepancy. And I think his inability to acknowledge it is what plagued people then and plagues people now.
Agreed. I think that's really an interesting conversation. So on the authenticity spectrum, John Adams wins, the most authentic person of the era, it seems to me, and you would know this better than anybody at the moment. And then at the other end of the spectrum, I think it is Jefferson. I think Jefferson is a creature out of a Jane Austen novel. So how he developed this persona, I don't know, but we have this idea of a man of exquisite civility who would offer you another glass of fine wine, and who would ask you a question about your research, and love of harmony in Jefferson. I think that's genuine. But he also was a man of power, and if you're a man of power or a woman of power, you're going to have to scratch sometimes and fight.
That you are. I don't know where it comes from either. I mean, some people have speculated that he hated his mother, although mothers, I think, tend to be a convenient scapegoat for a lot of men in history. So I'm not sure that that's necessarily true.
We have no evidence for his hate of his mother.
Yeah. So I think that certainly some of it is just personality. He didn't like conflict. He never liked conflict. Certainly some of it was accentuated by his experiences, and I think his diplomatic time was particularly formative in that regard, because he understood that maybe his natural proclivities for this mannered way of speaking and existing was really an asset, especially in France. Jefferson really understood that this way of being was an asset abroad. And so I think perhaps it was both a nature and a nurture situation.
So let's move on to number 4. When I wrote these, I had you in mind as I wrote them. I've spent several decades developing my view of this man, and it changes. Now I have you, and this other mind that wants to play, wants to engage, wants to mix it up, and so I'm really eager for your thoughts. And so when I wrote the 4th one, I thought, well, surely even Lindsay will agree with this, that Jefferson's greatness is not particularly his 8 years as president of the United States. If you're sort of making a list of the great presidents, he doesn't usually wind up in the first 5, and maybe not in the first 10. He was a kind of a quiet president. Luckily, he bought the Louisiana Territory, but he had a theory of government which made him a less than forceful president of the United States, less than forceful executive. But when I see his greatness, I see it in his languages. I see it in the Library of Congress. I see it in his architecture. I see it in his capacity as a writer of letters. I see it in his gardens. There's so many areas where Jefferson is just absolutely admirable. And then there is his time as a political figure. And it always seems to me that that's not the way we measure Thomas Jefferson. We measure others that way, say Franklin Roosevelt, but Jefferson's greatness is elsewhere, I think. How about you?
Oh, I completely agree. This is one of the ones that I agree with without reservation. I think he did a lot of extraordinary things and wrote a lot of beautiful and meaningful prose. So it's not to say that he didn't do good things as president or meaningful or impactful things, but I agree that it's certainly not the apex. It's the apex of his political career, but his career was so... it's really hard to put into a bucket. And so to call it a political career is it's almost a misnomer, because in some ways the fact that his minions go on to be his successors and continue the Democratic Republican or Jeffersonian Republican domination of the political scene is a continuation of his political career. And so I agree that he's very hard to define, and you really can't put him into just a political bucket, and that would be doing a disservice to so many other aspects of his life.
I don't think that Mr. Madison and Mr. Monroe would love to be called his minions, as you call them, but that's all right.
It's true, and that's not fair to Madison. Madison was, I think, in a lot of ways his partner and his successor. I do not extend the same revision to Monroe.
Jefferson, I think, would like our talking about him in this way, Lindsay, because his pose is that he is a gardener and a farmer and maybe a man of letters who wants to putter about on his mountain, but he was called by history and by the people to office, and he went reluctantly. He didn't really have any ambition. He was just a man who would have loved to live as a quiet country squire if we had been at peace with England, but because he was called upon by his nation, he did his best, and he felt that his heart was good, but his head might not be always equal to the challenge. I think he loved that trope. I don't think that trope really holds up. John Adams said, he's way more ambitious than he ever lets on.
Very true. The way that I see Jefferson and Madison is Jefferson is sort of the architect in that he is really good at drawing these beautiful creations. Madison is the engineer, the one that actually figures out how you build them and what that looks like and how to get it done. And so if Jefferson is a political architect, then Madison is the political engineer. And I think that's how their brains worked.
And Thoreau says in Walden, if you build castles in the air, great, but now put foundations under them. Jefferson is maybe our greatest castle in the air dreamer, but he always needed Madison to build the infrastructure and the scaffolding under it, and also to say, bring it down a little, Mr. J. Just bring it down into the real world just a little bit. Your dreams are beautiful, they're true, they're right, but we're fallen people, and we can't quite live up to this marvelous vision that you have of an agrarian republic. I love that about Jefferson, and he's been largely successful, at least until very recently, in imposing that conception of himself in American memory.
Yes. I mean, I think that was, in a lot of ways, politically useful for a very long time, especially at various moments in political parties, the vision of Jefferson as he saw himself was politically useful. And so it was advantageous for other politicians to continue to further that vision of Jefferson in that way. And so he had a lot of assistance in crafting himself in historical memory in the same way that he saw himself.
He's always getting a migraine when there's conflict, and he quietly slips out of the room and goes back to Monticello and retires for the 87th time and says that he's going to cancel all his subscriptions to newspapers and just live the quiet life, Candide-like, and maybe write a treatise now and then, but never publish it, only print it and distribute it to his private friends. Lovely. It's a lovely dream of his own life that Jefferson had. So let's move on. I'm talking to Lindsay Chervinsky about my 10 propositions about Mr. Jefferson. I'm doing pretty well. We're agreeing more than we're disagreeing here. This is, I think, the most important one, number 5. And I feel very strongly about this, that Jefferson's saying, I like a little rebellion now and then. It's as important in the political world as thunderstorms in the natural world. And the tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots. And we must never come down too hard on rebellions because they show that the people still are alive and care about their rights. Where that comes from in Jefferson, I just don't know. It's very odd for a man who never struck anyone in the course of his life, so far as we know. But it's also really dangerous, Lindsay. I mean, every knucklehead on January 6th thought of himself as fulfilling Jefferson's dream that you've got to fight, you've got to be willing to be volatile, you have to be willing to flare up when you feel that your basic liberties are being trampled upon. And he's sort of of all the presidents, I'm trying to think of another one. The only one close is Donald Trump, I would say, maybe Andrew Jackson. But of all the presidents, Jefferson is the one who keeps saying we need a little political violence.
Yeah, and we know that this has had a dangerous effect because, as you pointed out with January 6th, not only do they think of themselves in that way, but they often used rhetoric about 1776. So it was quite explicit, and there is very clear evidence that was on their minds. I agree with you that this is really dangerous because things like governments and institutions and norms and precedents are very easy to tear down. They're really hard to build. And when you build them, in order for them to acquire staying power, especially in institutions, Republican, Democratic institutions that require the participation and the goodwill of citizens, that are not enforced with like a monarchy or an autocracy top down, but require the goodwill and participation and buy-in of citizens. It takes a very long time to build the emotional ties and the staying power in those things. They have to be repeated time and time and time and time again. Generations after generations have to live with them, have to start to see them with reverence. And so to suggest that they should be torn down all the time is incredibly dangerous because building something new is really hard. And, one of our recent conversations was about the Constitutional Convention and how difficult it was to actually get any sort of agreement on a series of compromises. While that concept might be nice in theory, in lived practice, the French experience with revolutions demonstrates how dangerous it can be to just keep having them because it leads to violence, it leads to dictatorships, it leads to all sorts of really terrible things if you're not trying to craft something safely with staying power.
This one, I don't understand this. I want you to try to explain it to me. Where does this come from in Jefferson? Where in Jefferson does the love of blood come? I mean, obviously, we know he is not a man of blood. He didn't fire rifles in the war. He's an exquisitely peaceful, harmonic sort of person, and yet he has this bloodthirsty rhetoric.
Before I answer that, don't you think that from time to time Madison would get letters from Jefferson and would just let loose a string of expletives and go stomping out of the room and have to take a walk to calm himself down before replying because he would be so frustrated by him?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think all the time of what it must have been like to be Madison, let's open the mail and see what whopper Jefferson has said.
Yeah, just like a string of bleeps, imagine. Yeah. So with Jefferson, I think it's probably a couple of things. One, when we're going to get to this later, I think he did have a genuinely optimistic view of mankind and thought well of his fellow humans. As we will discuss it, I have no idea why he lived in the world and should have had no reason to feel that way, but he did. And so I think he genuinely hoped that future generations or future rebellions or whatever, of course they would come up with something better because humans are great. So, that's my generous interpretation. I think he also was remarkably skilled at putting on blinders and compartmentalizing his thoughts when he felt like it. We know that he lived through the early excesses and violence of the French Revolution. In fact, wrote about executions that occurred just down the street from him while he was still in Paris. And did so with sort of a stunning disregard for the lost life, or an amazing ability to forget about it pretty quickly. And so I think that if you're going to be that type of person, you have to have an ability to not see what's happening around you, or to compartmentalize it quite quickly.
This proposition that Jefferson was unusually attracted to blood and violence, or at least used that rhetoric and those metaphors in his writing, that's the most perplexing thing for me about Jefferson, even more perplexing than his attitudes about race and slavery. And when I started thinking about Jefferson 30 years ago, Lindsay, I thought it was kind of quaint. And I even admired it up to a point because it seemed so unrealistic. We lived in a time of great stability, really, through the last 50 years until the last 5 or 6. But now I don't think it's just quaint. I think it's really bad, that this is a real problem. And the founders, Jefferson wasn't alone. I mean, some of the other founders talked this way: give me liberty or give me death, don't tread on me, etc., etc. But Jefferson was the philosopher of this movement, and I don't quite understand it, but I know that it empowers some of the worst elements in American life. And I don't think the people of January 6th were trying to maintain the baseline of American liberty. They were trying to overturn a legitimate election, and cheered on by a former president. But I can't in any way regard them as heroes of human liberty who were, Jefferson said of Shays' rebels in 1786, well, they're misguided, but, we shouldn't be too hard on them, because even in their misguidedness, they remind us of what's at stake. I don't really want to be reminded of that too often, do you?
I don't. And, it's interesting because those examples that you gave of the don't tread on me and the give me liberty or give me death, those really happened at the beginning of the revolution. And one of the most common features of warfare that occurs time and time again is the people who experience it are then much less likely to call for it again in the future.
Yeah, so a couple of things. We need to take a short break here, Lindsay. But number one, that's what McKinley's response was to Theodore Roosevelt. McKinley had been a major in the Civil War. And he said, no, I am not wanting to be precipitated into an unnecessary war. One in a person's lifetime is quite enough. Thank you very much. And of course, Roosevelt was sporting for war and went and became a kind of odd hero in the Spanish-American War. But this reminds me, too, of your man Adams, who said of Jefferson concerning street action in Philadelphia during the Quasi-War, he said, as you know, no doubt you was fast asleep in philosophic tranquility, Mr. Jefferson.
Well, and what's so great about that line is that when the riots were happening, Jefferson wrote in his letters that it wasn't safe to go out into the streets at night. So he knew the dangers of it, and yet didn't seem to mind.
And Adams said, What think you of terrorism, Mr. Jefferson? What think you of terrorism? And Jefferson was just like, who is this guy? We need to take a short break. We're talking with Dr. Lindsay Chervinsky about 10 of my propositions about Thomas Jefferson. I'm doing pretty well. We're agreeing on most of them, and I think maybe you've changed my mind on a number of things. We'll be back with this special edition of Listening to America in just a moment. Stay tuned, everyone. Welcome back, everyone, to the special edition of Listening to America. I'm with my friend Dr. Lindsay Chervinsky, the author of her second book, this one on the second president, John Adams. We're talking about my 10 propositions about Thomas Jefferson after a lifetime of trying to make sense of him. Merrill Peterson, in his preface to his wonderful one-volume biography of Jefferson for Oxford University Press, said that in some respects, after all that time, he found Jefferson impenetrable. So number 6 in this list, Lindsay, Jefferson has much to answer for on race and slavery. Let me just put a full stop there. But it's not as awful as is sometimes alleged. It's awful. There's no excuse. there's no apology. We can't wish this away. We can't explain this away. We can't find some sort of a defense of Jefferson. But occasionally I see things that are so profoundly critical of him on this subject that it does, I think, do some damage to the historical record. He wrestled with this problem. He attempted to do some things, including in 1808, to get Congress to outlaw the slave trade. He made a number of proposals in the privacy of his study. Notes on Virginia has some thoughts about emancipation, gradual or immediate. What do you think? We've had this conversation before, of course, and we're going to have it again. How do we weigh this? How do we give enough condemnation of Jefferson's behavior, not that that's what historians are meant to do, and yet also realize that he was a man who had a conscience, who wrestled with this, who didn't know quite what to do, who meant it when he said we have the wolf by the ears? How do we assess this?
Yeah, it is really a predicament. And I think one of the reasons that people have such a hard time with Jefferson is because he wrote such exquisite things about liberty. And so it draws into sharp contrast areas where he failed to then take action in support of that liberty himself. And so often when we're evaluating other historical actors, we don't have that same contrast. And so it's easier to wrap our minds around. I think, we often talk about should we judge someone by the standards of their time, or should we judge them by today's standards, or how do we want to assess that? And in some ways, I think it's actually accurate to say that Jefferson was and should be judged as a man of his time, by which I mean he did have guilt and he wrestled with this institution, which a lot of people did at the time. He did not take action on it, which some people did. Not a lot, but some did. Of course, Washington did more than he did, and there were other people that did take more action. John Randolph is one who we're going to talk about in a future episode. There are others who did take action. So he fails in comparison to those that did. He was not as explicitly pro-slavery as some of the people that came later, like a John C. Calhoun or some of the positive good Southerners that put forth the argument that slavery was a positive good. And he also, I think one of the real challenges is we know so explicitly that he had this physical relationship with an enslaved woman in a way that we can guess at in other instances, or we know other people did too, but it's not as personal. It doesn't feel as personal because we don't know the names of all the people involved, and we don't know the ages of the children, and we don't know their life stories. So I think in this way, it's fair to say, of course, as you did, that he is deserving of a lot of blame. And yet that blame, I think rightly, should be put within the context of the time, which is in no way an apology for the behavior, but I think a better way to understand the systems that people were operating within.
My mentor in this respect, Everett C. Albers of the North Dakota Humanities Council, said judgment is easy, understanding is hard. Our duty as historians is to try to understand, to tease out the complexities, the way Jefferson sort of tied himself into knots over this issue. Let me try this proposition on you, Lindsay. There were a number of abolitionists and emancipationists, but they were almost all racists. That's different now. Today, there are racists, of course, and maybe all of us have some squibs and tinges of that in us. But we've largely overcome that sort of systematic, unquestioned race prejudice that existed at that time. But almost everybody in Jefferson's time who was white was a racist in the sense that they thought not clear what to make of Africans and African Americans, even the people who were much more forthright and successful in addressing the question of slavery. So I think that's part of when you say he was a man of his times. There's a zeitgeist, there's a way of seeing things that we all have. I think Jefferson clearly is a racist. I don't think you can deny that once you've read Notes on the State of Virginia. I don't think that makes him very different from, say, someone like Hamilton. But Hamilton was dramatically more likely to face this issue and to try to wrestle it to the ground than Jefferson. Does that square with your thinking?
Yeah, I think it is very valuable in some ways to separate or to draw a distinction between ideas on equality and ideas on the institution and existence of slavery and the enslaved existence. I think that you're right to say that those should almost be treated as separate conversations for the point of understanding the 18th century and the people who lived in them.
Jefferson kept saying all of his life, I look forward to seeing examples of black achievement. Well, he got some, and he had a hard time squaring that with his prejudices. But, since then, nobody can deny the extraordinary merits, talents, capacities, genius of Africans and African Americans. And so his challenge, which I think was partly genuine and partly disingenuous, it's been met and overmet. But let me just quickly turn to Sally Hemings for another moment. On the one end, some people say his relations with her had to have been rape, because how else can you characterize the enormous power differential and so on? On the other end of the spectrum, there's sort of the notion that they were star-crossed lovers across these racial lines, that there was a genuine love affair, affection, kind of a common law marriage that was made impossible by the racial distinctions of the era, and everything in between. I don't know the answer to this question. I get it that the power differential means that there's something corrupt in a person of power taking advantage in one way or another of a person who's powerless. But I also worry that by rushing to a really extraordinary critique of Jefferson, we may be missing part of the dynamic of the thing. What do you say?
So I think first and foremost, you can never fully erase the power dynamic from the situation, because there's no doubt that the power dynamic for the duration of the relationship certainly caused some form of coercion, whether it was super subtle, whether it was said or just felt, it was there. Full stop. However, I think to say that that's all it was actually denies a lot of humanity and agency and makes Sally into a very one-dimensional, pathetic character, and that is dehumanizing in a lot of ways, and I think is contradicted by a lot of the evidence, which is that she took a very bold stand to return to the United States from France. She could have stayed in France. She understood the laws. She was there with James. She spoke the language, at least partially. She could have done that, and she didn't. And a lot of people say, well, she was forced to go back. Maybe, but she was able to negotiate a series of conditions which were kept. So clearly she was able to negotiate them successfully in a way that most people were not able to operate within the realms of slavery. And so it is okay to say that it was both a coercive relationship and there may have also been affection. They're not mutually exclusive. It's okay to say, I think ill of him for this, but also respect the agency that she carved for herself in a really difficult situation.
She and her brother James came to Jefferson in France and challenged Jefferson and said, why should we return with you to the United States when we're free here under French law? What possible reason would we have to return to be enslaved at Monticello? And Jefferson negotiated with them a different deal for each of them. That's, I find, fascinating. I guess my point is that we should be very, very careful not to oversimplify this situation, that the slavery, for all of its horrors, is a human institution, and there were human friendships across these boundaries. There were collaborations. There was sometimes mutual trust and respect. There was codependency. That any simple answer to a question of this sort, particularly in a relationship that appears to have lasted for more than 3 decades, is, I think, a mistake, which doesn't exonerate Thomas Jefferson, but I think it's important to withhold judgment to a certain degree. Even when you say he was coercive, I think I would change that a little. I would say it was a coercive situation.
Yeah, I mean, we know that in his relationships, like with his daughters, that he could be pretty explicitly coercive. So it was not past him to do that or beyond him to do that. I think, and I want to be very clear to everyone listening that in no way should this conversation be construed as an apology or to suggest that slavery wasn't awful or that, enslaved people got good job skills out of the situation. We're not in any way saying that, but I do think what I find to be important is to remember that these were actually people and not belongings or property. And so it's essential to find the ways in which they worked to retain their own humanity, not to excuse the institution, but to treat them as the people that they were.
So let's move on to one where I'm pretty sure we agree 100%, that in the famous correspondence between 1812 and 1826, begun by Adams, when he sent Jefferson a polite little stiff letter and tried to enclose some of his son's most recent books, 1812, and suddenly the sluice gates of their ancient love and friendship opened, and they exchanged these 100 and some letters, and historians rave about their majesty and their beauty, and the reconciliation between these two great revolutionaries and so on. Even so, I've read the correspondence many times. I love the correspondence, and I love Jefferson more than I love John Adams. But I think Adams was far the better man in this, that Adams, first of all, he took the initiative. Jefferson often went silent. Adams kept poking him. I use that term deliberately. Adams wanted this. He wanted to work things out. He wanted them to explain themselves to each other. He wanted to fight a little bit in order to reach healing and clarity. And Jefferson is sort of frustratingly evasive. He's bobbing and weaving like Muhammad Ali, trying to let Adams punch himself out. I come away from the correspondence with a deeper love of John Adams and a little disappointment in Jefferson. How about you?
Yup.
A yup?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I come to it with a greater love for John Adams than Thomas Jefferson, obviously. And that will be no surprise to our listeners. I think that the humanity of John Adams was often his downfall in the political realm, but is what makes him so spectacularly fun to read, and I think what makes him lovable. And so it is not surprising to me in this discourse where they both have very little to lose. They're both retired. They're not going to go back into public office. If anything, John Adams has more to lose because his son does still have a political career. So any sort of exposition of these letters would be more damaging to him than it would be to Jefferson. And yet, and he's human, and he's open, and he's willing to admit his flaws, and he engages in real, honest discourse. And that is something that I think Jefferson struggled with, because it does require the engagement sometimes, and the good conflict that he didn't always like.
Agreed. Adams had more that he wanted to accomplish here. He was wanting to reconcile with Jefferson because I think he genuinely loved Jefferson. I mean the term love in a serious way. But he also was trying to redeem his reputation as against what he thought was America's incapacity to see his own greatness. And so he had something to prove. And Jefferson apparently thought he had nothing to prove.
For me, at least, one of the marks of a really great man, and I say man as in mankind, not gender, is an ability to understand one's flaws and to atone for them, to acknowledge them, to in some ways try and better them, but just to be very understanding that we all have them. I don't think there's anything to be embarrassed about in the acknowledgement of a flaw. It's really how you respond to that is what makes the measure of a man. And so that's where I think it is disappointing that at the end of his life, Jefferson couldn't acknowledge more wrongdoing when there was plenty for him to say.
We're going to run out of time. We have 3 more to go. They're really important too.
The last 2 I agree with without reservation, so we can bang through those. It's the third to last.
Jefferson's lifelong fascination with the American West was the making of our Continental Union. Of all of his contemporaries, not even your man Washington had such a continental vision. Madison wouldn't have bought Louisiana, I don't think. Monroe, maybe, probably not. Adams, certainly not. Isn't it Jefferson who gave us the West?
No. Well, first of all, I think they all were fairly unanimous by Jefferson's presidency that the West was pretty essential to the future of the nation. It's important to remember that Washington died in 1799. So his ability to see a more expansive West was somewhat limited by his death. But he was a firm believer in westward expansion and in the importance of the West to actually the strength of the Union and holding people together, and invested himself personally and financially in canal projects to make that happen. Certainly, Jefferson's view of science and exploration was very conducive to ensuring that continued to happen. I don't think that Jefferson was the only one that could have done the Louisiana Purchase, because Madison was his Secretary of State while it happened and was very encouraging of it from the very beginning. And Monroe was so freaking eager to get to Paris to make this deal happen that he kind of tried to steal all the credit, and people forget that Robert Livingston was already there as the minister to France. So I think at this point, and by this point, people had been talking about how do we get the Floridas? How do we get New Orleans for decades? And, Hamilton wanted to do it by force, and the others wanted to buy it. And so I think it was at this point almost a unanimous consent that some sort of purchase had to happen. And it was Jefferson's good fortune to be in office when Napoleon decided to cut his losses on the colonial project and just offer it up wholesale rather than continuing to sink money, blood, and fortune in the North American project.
We'll fight about this another time. I agree mostly with what you say. I do think that it's more than luck. I think Jefferson's diplomatic patience, his playing the long game, he was a superb diplomat.
Oh, let's do 10 things about the Louisiana Purchase then.
Yeah, we will. All right, the last two are these. Jefferson's optimism about human nature and his belief that we are up to it. It's just fundamentally wrong. That's one proposition. It's just wrong. I mean, and I'm always shocked that he believed that human nature was perfectible. I mean, we want to say, have you looked around much, Mr. Jefferson? And then finally, I wonder what you think about. I think you agree with that, right? That there's just something cracked.
Yeah, I mean, I'm inclined. I always want to ask, have you met humans? And he lived through the Revolution, so he knew that the corruptible power of the corruptible influence of power and fame and all of these things. And have you met humans is the question I always want to ask.
So we'll leave that one for the moment because we agree wholeheartedly on it. And the last one is, I think, maybe slightly contentious. With the possible exception of Patrick Henry, among major figures in the founding, is Jefferson the most radical?
Yes, I think for the duration of his lifetime. I think there were moments perhaps when Patrick Henry was more radical, but he actually became a fairly steadfast supporter of the Constitution and the federal government after the ratification and the Bill of Rights. But I think Jefferson maintains his radicalism much longer.
Jefferson didn't reveal all of this radicalism during his lifetime, so people didn't know how radical he was. I think if he had been transparent about his views, he could never have been elected to the presidency of the United States.
Yeah, certainly in things like his views on religion and establishments, and even his ideas on the frequency of revolutions, those things were not spoken about all the time at that point, and I think would have been disqualifying.
We're out of time, I'm sorry to say, Dr. Lindsay Chervinsky. It would be comfortable for me to say, well, I've obviously had a great influence on you over the last couple of years because you seem to agree on most of this, but I don't claim that at all. I really prize your view. I so appreciate your insights, and I hope everyone has enjoyed this special issue of Listening to America. We'll see you all next week for another important episode in Listening to America.